Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This is our book, Introduction to World Philosophy. So this is the exam 4 questions we're going over. In this video, we're going over part A, number 4, which is compare Hume's virtue theory to Aristotle's. How are they similar? How are they different? And part B, question 8. Why does Hume reject the claim that virtue is nothing but a conformity to reason? Okay, so I'm going to actually start by going back over Aristotle. We compared Aristotle's 3 parts of the soul to Plato's idea of 3 parts of the soul in a previous video, but we didn't get into the details of Aristotle's philosophy. So I'll go over that, and then I'll get into Hume, and we'll compare the two. And in the process, we'll explain why Hume says the reason doesn't provide us with knowledge of morality. What it is, according to Hume, is feeling. You feel, when you observe people acting, certain types of actions make you feel, oh, that's a good person. And when someone does something that makes you feel like they're evil, well, then that's what's telling you what is virtue and what is vice. And he says, if you watch just a play, actors on a stage, whatever emotions rise up for each scene will tell you the source of our ideas about vice and virtue. It's not reason discovering the idea of justice. It is simply we feel a certain way. And so reason, he'll say, has no influence on our feelings. Reason can help us discover objects of desire, and the desires will give us a motivation to act, but it's not reason that's telling us the thing is desirable. Reason is and always ought to be the slave of the passions, is one of the quotes from Hume. Reason says, okay, this is what you like? All right then, I'll help you find out easier ways to get there. But reason can't say this is good and this is bad, act like this and act like that. Reason responds to the passions or the feelings. Oh, you feel like people are despicable when they behave that way and they lie and they cheat? Okay, I'll help you figure out a way to live a life without lying and cheating. So reason doesn't motivate morality. Your passions motivate morality, and reason is the slave of those passions. That's David Hume, and it's not that different from Aristotle. So Aristotle came after Plato, and Aristotle was more, his idea of the absolute ideas weren't these transcendental ideas so much as inherent in matter. The forms only exist in conjunction with matter, although he does have theories of forms existing in the outermost spheres of the universe, but we're not going to get into that for our purposes here. For our purposes, this is from the Nicomachean Ethics from Aristotle, and he's just trying to say, you know, what would a political scientist have to know in order to be a good political scientist? He'll have to know about the soul and how to have a virtuous soul to become happy. That's what he's aimed at. But virtue, he's saying, it's not an exact science that reason can discern. A lot of it has to come just from your upbringing. Then you have to be able to feel the appropriate way in a given situation. And if you have to habituate yourself. The key word for Aristotle is habit. You develop virtues by repeatedly acting in a virtuous way. Well, what determines virtue? He'll say, well, it's not reason alone, but what reason can help you find is the golden mean between two extremes, one of excess and one of deficiency. So that's his practical advice. And this is the key role that reason plays. So it helps us find that mean between the two extremes of vice. So let me just get into some of the details here. On page 88, Aristotle says, actually no, this is the introduction. On page 90, this is Aristotle's own words, and in our selection they skip sections, so I'll try to fill in the blanks, and there's an important one right at the beginning. They skip section 2, so it starts with section 1, then it skips to section 3. But at the very beginning, page 90, every art and every inquiry, and similarly, every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. So that's what Plato said in the Republic, in the cave allegory. The idea of the good is the ultimate absolute idea which encompasses all of the other ones, like the idea of justice and courage, and the more the objects like tree and table. Everything that exists, every noun you can think of, correlates to some absolute essence of that thing, of that, or abstract concept like justice. They all exist in the perfect form in the outermost sphere of the universe, and that's where God perceives them, and that's what makes God who God is. There's some debate about what Plato meant by the word God. He uses the word God singularly and in a plural, kind of interchangeably. He's not very strict about it, but at any rate, that is Plato's idea of the good. It's the source of all those other absolute ideas. And we'll see on page 91, Aristotle kind of, it seems to me, makes a little bit light of Plato's idea of the self-subsistent in cause, the original good. But at any rate, every action is aimed at a good, but there's different actions, and each action corresponds to a particular art or science. And the end of the master arts are to be preferred to all the subordinate ends. So there's an art of medicine. You've got your ear, nose and throat doctor, your eye doctor, every part of your body has a doctor attached to it, but all of those sciences are subdivisions of the overall medical science. And the medical science, is it a subdivision of any other science? He'll go on to say in section 2, which we don't have here, that yes, all of the sciences are subordinate to political science because the politicians decide which of the other sciences are even studied in the state. If your science doesn't get much funding, it doesn't get much study. So political science subordinates all of the other sciences, so whatever the goal or the good at which political science aims, whatever that good is, will encompass all of the other goods of all of the lesser sciences. So then he'll go on to say, okay, so also he says, and he repeats it, that we can't have a precise understanding of political science. It's just not the nature of the beast. You can have precise understanding of mathematics, but he says it would be equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. He says, when you're dealing with things like virtue and what people consider to be virtuous and vicious, there's so much difference of opinion that the best you can hope for is a rough outline. And that's all we really need for political science, he'll say. And it's a sign of wisdom to only look for a certain amount of detail. So he's saying we're only looking for a general outline of what constitutes virtue and vice. And that will agree with Hume, more or less, who says reason does not have any definite process by which to discern virtue or vice. It's coming from your feelings, and feelings are a kind of a amorphous thing. How can you tell exactly? You know what they are, but they're subjective. They exist. They're real things. So at any rate, I will. Aristotle goes on to say, because of the nature of political science, young men are not good at it because you need to develop an understanding through empirical observations. That's another thing Hume has in common with Aristotle. They think that knowledge comes from experience, from sense perceptions, and just living your daily life. It's not remembering the absolute ideas that you perceived in a previous life, which is what Plato says. For Aristotle, you're a blank slate, and your reason can discern the forms that are structuring the matter around you, but those forms are inherent in the world. That he's not focusing on another world, although again he does mention God existing at the outermost sphere of the universe, which is what Plato also said. But for Aristotle and Hume, experience is the source of knowledge. It's not remembering the absolute ideas from a previous life. So, on page 91, on the right-hand column, section 4, he says, let us resume our inquiry and state, in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good, what is it that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action? And then he'll say it's happiness. Happiness is what everyone seeks for its own sake. You seek wealth for its own sake, plus you want to be happy. You seek beauty for its own sake, plus you want to be happy. You seek whatever good thing you seek for its own sake, plus happiness. Happiness is the only thing you seek for its own sake. I want to be happy so I can be wealthy. That's not, you want to be wealthy so you can be happy, not the other way around. If you're happy, you're content. What do you need money for? You're self-sufficient. And that's what happiness is. It's the self-sufficient good and the ultimate good at which everything aims. Okay, well then what constitutes a happy life? And he goes, well, now that's a little bit more of a different question. So, but here's where he takes a kind of a jab at Plato, it seems to me. He says, what is happiness? The many do not give the same account as the wise, for the former think it is some plain and obvious thing like pleasure, wealth, or honor. They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things, with health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor, but conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great ideal that is above their comprehension. This is Plato's absolute ideas existing in the outermost heaven where you can go after death. So now some thought that apart from these many goods, there is another, which is self-subsistent and causes the goodness of all these as well. To examine all the opinions that have been held were perhaps somewhat fruitless, enough to examine those that are most prevalent or that seem to be arguable. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles, for Plato too was right in raising this question and asking, as he used to do, are we on the way from or to the first principles? Well, notice he mentions Plato after mentioning that, some people talk about a self-subsistent good that causes the goodness of all others, and this is kind of a highfalutin idea. So, at any rate, Aristotle is not saying that the way to become virtuous is to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good after ascending through the four levels of opinion to absolute knowledge. He's saying the way to become virtuous is by being raised properly. So if you've been raised poorly, you're already at a great disadvantage. And then to just develop habits, good habits. And what are good habits? Again, there's no strict rule that reason can tell you. You have to just have been brought up right. Either you know or you don't. And once you can identify what good habits are, reason can help you achieve the goal by showing you the golden mean between two extremes of vice. So you want the mean, the virtue of courage is squeezed between two vices, one of deficiency, which would be cowardice, and one of excess, which would be rashness. If you're a soldier, you stand your ground, you do what your commanding officer says, you don't go charging off at the army when everyone else is in formation. That would be rash and useless, more or less. And you don't turn tail and run. That would be cowardice. You stand your ground and you do what a soldier is supposed to do. That's courage. And what is, he says, and you can't get much more exact than that. You have to have a general understanding of these things, and you have to develop the habit, and you have to start to feel the right way when you're acting that way. If you stand your ground but you're trembling within the whole time, you haven't developed the virtue of courage. But when you finally have done it enough times that you just stand there, you're not perturbed in your mind and you're calm and you're just ready to do your duty, then you've developed the virtue. So I'm just, it's a little preface of what's to come here. So on page 92, he's saying, okay, so what's the final good? We're back to this. On the right-hand column at the top of page 92. Now, such a thing, happiness above all, is held to be. It's the ultimate good, the final good without qualification, for which it's self-sufficient. So for this we choose always for self and never for the sake of something else. But honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we choose indeed for themselves. If for nothing resulted from them, we should still choose each of them. But we choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we shall be happy. Happiness, on the other hand, no one chooses for the sake of these, nor in general for anything other than itself. From this point of view of self-sufficiency, the same result seems to follow, for the final good is thought to be self-sufficient. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of action. All right, so happiness is the ultimate goal. All right, that's fine, but that still doesn't tell us what makes a human being happy. And then he goes on to say, well, maybe we can find out what constitutes human happiness if we knew what the function of a man is. as he says, for just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So would it seem to be for man, if he has a function. So he's like, a carpenter has a function, a tanner has a function, but man has no function. An eye and a hand and a foot have a function, but the man in general doesn't have a function. I think this is one of the big points where Aristotle would differ from Hume. Hume would probably say, no, there's no inherent function of a human being. That's nothing that you can perceive with your sense perceptions. And it's just something that you might make up out of your imagination, but it's not inherent to reality. And another big difference between Hume and Aristotle is developing this philosophy for the sake of giving a practical guide for action, whereas Hume is developing his philosophy not to give any kind of a guide for how you should behave, but just for a purely philosophical purpose of saying reason is not the source of virtue. It's simply your feelings. Reason can't be, morals, virtue and vice, those are parts of moral science. And he's saying morality can cause you to act or not to act. But reason is an inactive principle. It only presents options. It doesn't give directions. It's not a legislator. Only passions can make you move, and therefore reason can't be the source of morality. So, he's giving just a philosophical point. Aristotle provides a lot of philosophical points, but just as a preface for practical action, because he thinks humans have a natural function, and the natural function for a human is to behave rationally. Now we see David Hume acting very rationally. That's what he's doing. He's using reason, but he's not saying, I'm therefore exemplifying the essence of a human being and fulfilling the human function at the highest level. He doesn't, I don't think, have that belief. He doesn't think there is any absolute sense of the function of anything, that those are human inventions. All right, so on page 93, the left-hand column, Aristotle says, well, there's different parts of the soul, or different functions of the soul. There's the nutrition aspect, which we have in common with plants. We have sense perceptions, which we have in common with the animals. But the one thing that distinguishes us from every other species is the rational principle. So the function of a human being must be to behave according to reason, or at least to behave in conjunction with what reason discovers. So it's, again, Aristotle's not going to say reason is the sole guide to morality. Reason is responding to the appropriate feelings. And if you have a role model of a courageous person, then reason says, oh, that makes you feel happy. If you could resemble those kinds of actions, here's how you do it. Find the golden mean between these two extremes. Okay, so on the left-hand column, 93. Now, if the function of man is an activity of soul, which follows or implies a rational principle. Now, this is a long sentence with a colon in the middle. I'm gonna skip some parts so that it doesn't get too bogged down. So now, if the function of man is an activity of soul, which follows or implies a rational principle, and if we say so-and-so and a good so-and-so have a function which is the same in kind, for example, a liar and a good lyre player, and so without qualification in all cases, eminence in respect of goodness being added to the name of the function, if this is the case, and we can state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed, when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, now here's the final definition, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue. And if there is more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete, but we must add, in a complete life. Okay, so human good, which is happiness. We aim at some good. What's the ultimate good? Happiness. Well, what constitutes human happiness? An activity of soul in accordance with virtue. How does this differ with David Hume? David Hume says that there is no soul. Can you perceive it with your sense perceptions? No. Well, then it's just the figment of your imagination. Aristotle's idea of a soul isn't the same as Plato's. Plato's idea of a soul is some non-composite essence of consciousness which contains all of the absolute ideas, and its nature is to contemplate the absolute idea of the good. It's kind of like a spark from the spiritual sun called the idea of the good. So for Aristotle, the soul, he doesn't talk about reincarnation, so it's not this eternal seed imprinted with all the absolute ideas. It's more of a blank slate waiting to receive the ideas into itself. Its nature is to receive the imprint of the forms which are forming matter around themselves. So for Aristotle, matter is this potential state, and when the structuring form, which is this invisible ordering principle, comes in contact with the matter, which is this potential state, then you see organic things start to develop. They peak towards an approximation of the perfect form, and then they let go of the form as they degenerate. So that's kind of a soul. It's not exactly the kind of a soul that David Hume was saying, I don't perceive it anywhere, so I don't think it exists. So it's more of a subtle difference, because we'll see with David Hume when he starts talking about virtue, he says we do have passions. Well, the implication is if we have passions, there must be some ground for the passions to be rooted in, although in his other essays he's saying, no, there's no self. He's like the Buddhists, all you see is a flux of perceptions. Where's the self? If the self is the same from moment to moment, it must have all the memories of every sense impression and emotion that you've ever experienced in front of its eyes simultaneously. That's not the case, therefore there is no self. So, all right, so back to Aristotle. If this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue. And if there's more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. So, therefore, he's saying a political scientist must understand the soul. The students of politics, then, must study the soul, and must study it with these objects in view. Okay, and then some things are said about it adequately enough. He's talking about the soul, even in the discussions outside our school, and we must use these. For example, that one element in the soul is irrational, and one has a rational principle. Then he says, whether they're separate entities or just different characteristics of the same thing, that's not important for our purposes here. And we discussed this when we compared Aristotle's idea of the soul to Plato's idea of the soul in the Republic. So for Plato, there was and in the Phaedrus, there's the rational principle, and then there's two irrational principles. One he calls passion, and the other one is desire. Passion tends to obey the rational principle, and it tries to coerce the desire aspect of the soul to obey what reason determines. So Hume will say reason is just the slave of passions. It doesn't give anybody any directions. And Aristotle, what he's saying is similar to that we're motivated by the feeling of happiness. We want it. We desire to feel happy. It's not reason telling us, oh, always choose the golden mean, and that's why we do it. We do it because we want to be happy. Hey, reason, I want to be happy. Help me figure out a plan. Yes, sir, passionate desire for happiness. I'll figure out a plan. Looks like the best way is try to find the golden mean between two extremes of vice. All right, then, let's do it. So reason isn't giving commands. For Hume, it's passion that's giving the commands. And then reason is saying, here's your alternatives, here's the best one to achieve the goal that you desire, sir. And then passion says, okay, but then maybe the desiring lower bodily appetites might sway you from your rational plan. But it's a subtle point here about the relationship between reason and morality, reason and virtue. So you've got these, for Hume, he's saying reason can't guide any action. It can't give any motive for action. And Aristotle and Plato in some sense agree, because they're saying there's the rational part of the soul, and then there's the irrational part, but the irrational part has two parts, one of which tends to obey reason, the other of which tends to disobey reason. We see that on page 94. Left-hand column, Aristotle says, there seems to be also another irrational element in the soul, one which in a sense, however, shares an irrational principle. So no doubt, however, we must nonetheless suppose that in the soul too there is something contrary to the rational principle, resisting and opposing it. Now, even this seems to have a share in a rational principle, as we said. At any rate, in the continent man, it obeys the rational principle, and presumably in the temperate and brave man, it is still more obedient, for in him it speaks on all matters with the same voice as the rational principle. So, these passions, this part of the irrational soul, which tends to obey reason, is what makes the rest of your desires fall in line. So it's kind of an intermediate. The reason is not giving the commands. It is the desire for happiness that's giving the commands. That's the overall goal toward which all of your actions are striving, although reason can help you figure that out. And then when you're living your daily life and trying to behave virtuously, you have to tame certain impulses to do vicious things. And what Aristotle is saying here is that part of that irrational part of your soul tends to obey what reason commands. Now that's the question. Does reason really command you to do it, or is reason just discovering options, and then it's the passion that's making the judgments? You could read Aristotle in both ways, because this irrational part of the soul that agrees with reason, he says, it has the same voice as the rational principle. If we quickly look on page 157, because this is an important point to compare to David Hume, he'll say the same thing. What you think is reason is actually a passion that speaks calmly and is similar, therefore, to reason, and you mistake the two. So on page 157, he says, thus the course of the argument leads us to conclude that since vice and virtue are not discoverable merely by reason or the comparison of ideas, like Plato's absolute ideas, it must be by means of some impression or sentiment they occasion that we are able to mark the difference betwixt them. Our decisions concerning moral rectitude and depravity are evidently perceptions. And as all perceptions are either impressions or ideas, the exclusion of the one is a convincing argument for the other. We'll get into his terminology after we finish Aristotle. Morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of, though this feeling or sentiment is commonly so soft and gentle that we are apt to confound it with an idea, according to our common custom of taking all things for the same which have any near resemblance to each other. So the moral feelings, he's saying, we confuse with the relations of ideas, which is reason. Reason examines the relationships between the ideas we form in our mind, like cause and effect. Oh, this happens, and then that happens. A happens, and then B repeatedly. Oh, well, there seems to be a relationship. A causes B. And that's what reason deals with, these relations of ideas. Hume will say these relations of ideas are inventions of the human mind. They might be very helpful for survival, but they're not rooted in reality. They are fictions that we create. But the feelings which motivate our morals are not relations of ideas. They're just actual passions, although they might seem like rational ideas because they're not so agitating. If they're soft and gentle passions, we mistake them for reason. So that's the reason a lot of people think morality comes from reason. That was 157. I just point that out because back on page 94, Aristotle's talking about the rational principle of the soul and then the two parts of the irrational, one that obeys reason or works in concord with reason, and then one that tends to disobey what reason discovers to be the best course of action. So now, and I'll read that again. Now, even if this seems to have a share in a rational principle, as we said, at any rate, in the continent man, it obeys the rational principle, and presumably in the temperate and brave man, it is still more obedient, for in him it speaks on all matters with the same voice as the rational principle. Therefore, the irrational element also appears to be twofold. All right, so then he says, in that same way, we have virtue too on the right-hand column of page 94. Virtue too is distinguished in two kinds in accordance with this difference. For we say that some of the virtues are intellectual and others moral. Philosophical wisdom and understanding, and practical wisdom being intellectual. All right, so, philosophical wisdom and understanding and practical wisdom being intellectual, liberality and temperance being moral. So, intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue is just studying what morality is. And moral virtue is actually developing the habits that make you a moral person. It's put into action. When he talks about practical wisdom, that's you know what you should do, but moral virtue is then following through. If you look on page 96 on the right-hand column at the top, he says, but most people do not do these, but take refuge in theory and think they are being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. So, another difference between Hume and Aristotle in these two essays that we're reading by them is that Aristotle is trying to give us a guide for practical action, and Hume is not. Hume is doing an intellectual study of virtue. What is virtue? It's nothing, it's not using your reason to perceive some absolute ideas, like the idea of justice or the idea of the good. Virtue is a feeling that you have, and then reason will help you have that feeling more often and avoid the contrary feeling. So this work by Aristotle is a work of intellectual virtue because it's his intellect explaining and defining all these things, but the goal is to help you achieve moral virtue. All right, so back on 94, he says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral, intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence also its name, ethike, is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos, which means habit. So the very word ethics is rooted in the word ethos, which means habit. You have to habitually do things to develop a virtue. For instance, then he says, from this it is plain that none of the moral virtues arise in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. He's saying, take a stone. Its nature is to fall towards the earth. You can throw it up in the air 1,000,000 times. You'll never habituate it to keep going up. So we don't have virtues by nature. You're not born courageous. You're not born temperate. You have to develop those. We are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit. So you have the potential to become virtuous, but you won't actually become virtuous if you don't habitually act in a virtuous way. So too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. This is confirmed by what happens in states, for legislators make citizens good by forming habits in them. And this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not affect it miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. So a good constitution for a state develops good, virtuous habits in the citizens, and a good constitution in the individual does the same and teaches you how to become virtuous. And we'll go over that. And again, he reasserts on the right-hand column of page 95, but this we must be agreed upon beforehand, that the whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline and not precisely, as we said at the very beginning, that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. So that matters concerned with conduct and questions of what is good for us have no fixity any more than matters of health. The general account being of this nature, the account of particular cases is yet more lacking in exactness, for they do not fall under any art or precept, but the agents themselves must in each case consider what is appropriate to the occasion. This happens also in the art of medicine or of navigation. All right, so that's going to be a resemblance to David Hume. He's saying reason can't exactly define some formula to determine what virtue is in every case. It can give you a rough outline of how to achieve that. But you have to go into the situation and feel your way through it, like Hume would say. You have to have had enough experience to kind of get a sixth sense or an inner feeling for how things are supposed to unfold. And this is where he gets into the rough outline idea, which is just finding the mean between two extremes. And also he defines virtue as a state of character. So on page 96, actually I'm going to skip to page 97, the right-hand column. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, i.e. the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. But not every action or every passion admits of a mean, so he modulates the theory there. But here's the key part. Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, which is determined by a rational principle, as a man of practical wisdom would determine it. So that's the role of reason. It's not the commander so much. What's the ultimate commander of your soul is the desire for happiness. Reason just is the servant of that desire, and it helps you find the golden mean. Plus, for Aristotle, reason is the function, the definitive function of a human being. It's what separates us from all other living creatures. So happiness is performing your function well, and human happiness, therefore, is reasoning well. And how do we reason well? We reason towards the ultimate good. What's the ultimate good? Happiness. It's the one good we seek for its own sake, never for anything else. How does reason help you become happy? Well, for a human, it helps you develop your ultimate function so reason is the function of humans. Happiness is performing your function well. So reason helps you be happy by discerning the virtuous mean between two extremes of vice. All right, let's go to Hume, and then we'll backtrack to Aristotle as we compare the two. So Hume's empiricist ethics. And this is from a treatise of human nature. Now, page 155. On the left-hand column, up at the top. Now, as perceptions resolve themselves into two kinds, impressions and ideas, this distinction gives rise to a question with which we shall open up our present inquiry concerning morals. Whether 'tis by means of our ideas or impressions we distinguish betwixt vice and virtue and pronounce an action blamable or praiseworthy. This will immediately cut off all loose discourse and declamations and reduce us to something precise and exact on the present subject. So Aristotle would say, oh, we're not looking for anything precise and exact, we're looking for a rough outline. And yet Aristotle was he was every bit as precise as David Hume is. And what David Hume is saying is he's not giving a precise ruling on how to behave virtuously. All he's saying is I'm giving you a precise definition of what virtue is, or morals. Someone is virtuous, we say, when observing their character makes us feel happy or good inside. And someone's vicious when we feel inside a feeling that makes us think it's a negative way to behave. That's his ultimate lesson. It's not reason. So we'll continue here. So impressions and ideas. Sense impressions is what he's talking about, and relations of ideas. Sense impressions he also calls matters of fact. You can see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. That's a sense impression. An idea, relations of ideas are connecting these sense impressions. How are these sense impressions related? Those are called relations of ideas. They're not empirical facts. They are fictions humans use to help us navigate our way through the world. They might be very useful, but they're not necessarily true everywhere in the universe. They're inventions of the humans for practical purposes. We would die if we didn't use them. For example, the idea of cause and effect. It's very valuable for us to have it, but he's saying if you examine it, it's nothing you can perceive with a sense perception. Therefore, it's a creation of your imagination. All right, so he's saying if all that exists are perceptions, and we saw this with when he was agreeing with Berkeley. As an empiricist, David Hume says, what do you actually perceive? I perceive sense perceptions, and then emotions and memories. I don't perceive any physical object outside of my perception of it, as Berkeley said. But then again, Hume says I don't also perceive a mind. I don't perceive a self that's the same from moment to moment. All I actually perceive are sense perceptions themselves, and then the relations of ideas that I create around those sense perceptions. So, what is morality? Is it a sense impression, or is it a relation of ideas? He's saying it's neither. It's a third category of being. It's an inner feeling, but you could call that an impression. But it's an inner impression. So, all right, so now, continuing here on 155 on the left-hand column, those who affirm that virtue is nothing but a conformity to reason, that there are eternal fitnesses and unfitnesses of things, which are the same to every rational being that considers them, this is what Plato would say, that the immutable measures of right and wrong impose an obligation, not only on human creatures, but also on the deity himself. All these systems concur in the opinion that morality, like truth, is discerned merely by ideas and by their juxtaposition and comparison. In order, therefore, to judge of these systems, we need only consider whether it be possible from reason alone to distinguish betwixt moral good and evil, or whether there must concur some other principles to enable us to make that distinction. And he'll say, yes, we do need another principle, our feelings, our passions. I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here just to go to the end to help you make sense of the details. On page 157, he said, on the right-hand column, he says, a very play or romance may afford us instances of this pleasure, which virtue conveys to us, and pain, which arises from vice. When you watch a play, you see the characters on the stage. If a character acts virtuously, that's just another way of saying it endears us to them. We think they're a good person. When a character acts viciously at the villain of the play, oh, you villain, I hope you get yours in the end. That's what's telling you what vice is. It's not reason, it's your inner feelings. Observe daily life. When you feel good about the way people act, that's what you call virtue. It's not reason discovering the idea of justice, which exists independently of the material world and the outermost sphere of the universe. It is just something that you discover through living your daily life and feeling what you feel when you see people act. So their character compels you to feel certain ways. That's the source. Then reason, he says, can help you as a mediator to increase your good feelings by acting virtuously and associating with virtuous people, but it's just the slave of passions. It's that passionate feeling that's ruling the ship of your... He doesn't believe in a self, but who you are, this ever-changing, amorphous unit of changing sense perceptions and opinions. It's hard for Hume to have some of his moral philosophy without having a self to root these passions in. But so I'm just going to continue here on the left-hand column, page 155. So he says, if morality had naturally no influence on human passions and actions, 'twere in vain to take such pains to inculcate it, and nothing would be more fruitless than the multitude of rules and precepts with which all moralists abound. So what he's going to say is reason has no influence on human passions. It's the slave of the human passions. Philosophy is commonly divided into speculative and practical, and as morality is always comprehended under the latter division, 'tis supposed to influence our passions and actions, and to go beyond the calm and indolent judgments of the understanding. So, morality has an influence on your actions. It influences your passions, your moral beliefs motivate you to act. Therefore, morality can't be rooted in reason because reason has no ability to influence your passions. Morality must be another passion. What is morality? It's what you feel in regards to human behavior. And that is what is motivating you to be moral. I don't want to feel horrible about myself, so therefore I will behave morally. Then reason will say, okay, this is what makes you feel horrible, therefore let's figure out ways not to act like that. Continuing here on the left-hand column, 155, David Hume says, since morals therefore have an influence on the actions and affections, it follows that they cannot be derived from reason, and that because reason alone, as we have already proved, can never have any such influence, morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Reason of itself is utterly impotent in this particular. The rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of our reason. I'm skipping a little bit. As long as it is allowed that reason has no influence on our passions and actions, and it has no influence on our passions and actions, 'tis in vain to pretend that morality is discovered only by a deduction of reason. An active principle can never be founded on an inactive, and if reason be inactive in itself, it must remain so in all its shapes and appearances. Okay, so it's reason alone can't uncover the rules of morality, and that would agree with Aristotle. He would say that it's happiness that we're after, the feeling of happiness. And you have to be raised in a good household to have the initial habits to make you detect the right kinds of behavior in people. But when you perceive someone behaving courageously, that makes you feel good inside, and you're automatically, instinctively always acting towards achieving happiness. That's the ultimate goal that we achieve, we seek for its own sake and nothing else. And reason can help us be happy for Aristotle by finding the golden mean between two extremes. I'll continue here with David Hume. 155 on the right-hand column. Reason is the discovery of truth or falsehood. Truth or falsehood consists in agreement or disagreement either to the real relations of ideas or to real existence and matter of fact. Whatever therefore is not susceptible of this agreement or disagreement is incapable of being true or false and can never be an object of our reason. All right, relations of ideas and matters of fact. I talked about this before. Matters of fact are sense perceptions. If you see it, smell it, hear it, taste it, or touch it, that's a matter of fact. Relations of ideas are how we categorize those matters of fact. For example, the idea of cause and effect. This happens, then that happens. So this must cause that. Hume doesn't believe in causality. He knows we do that. That's a natural mental habit, and we need to do it. But he just says, but don't fool yourself into thinking you're discovering universal absolute laws of nature, like Plato would talk about. Oh, I've discovered this idea of God's mind that God uses to organize the universe. That's not the fact, says Hume. We invent these relations of ideas. Facts are sense perceptions. So, if morality is an object of reason, if you can discover morality through reason alone, then it must be some kind of a relation of idea. But he'll say, it's not like that. All morality is a feeling that you have. So I'll just continue to read here. Whatever therefore is not susceptible of this agreement or disagreement is incapable of being true or false and can never be an object of our reason. Now, 'tis evident our passions, volitions, and actions are not susceptible of any such agreement or disagreement. Being original facts and realities complete in themselves and implying no reference to other passions, volitions, and actions, 'tis impossible, therefore, they can be pronounced either true or false and be either contrary or conformable to reason. All right, you see someone stoop down to help a wounded bird on the sidewalk, and you think, oh, that's compassionate, that's going to be a big trouble for that person. That's that feeling that you have is a passion. Is it true or false? I mean, it's not true. What do you mean, is it true or false? It is what it is. It's a self-evident reality. Truth true and false only apply to relations of ideas, which humans create. The very ideas of truth and falsehood are human creations. They're not matters of fact, whereas emotions are matters of fact. So, I'm going to continue here. This argument is of double advantage to our present purpose, for it proves directly that actions do not derive their merit from a conformity to reason, nor their blame from a contrariety to it, and proves the same truth more indirectly by showing us that, as reason can never immediately prevent or produce any action by contradicting or approving of it, it cannot be the source of moral good and evil, which are found to have that influence. Skipping down a little, we're on page 156. Reason is wholly inactive and can never be the source of so active a principle as conscience or a sense of morals. Reason and judgment may indeed be the mediate cause of an action by prompting or by directing a passion. So that is similar to what Aristotle is saying. Reason is serving the ultimate passion for happiness. You want to be happy. And then it will therefore help you become happy by discerning the golden mean of virtue between the two extremes of vice. That's more or less in agreement with what Hume is saying here. Reason and judgment may indeed be the immediate cause of an action by prompting or by directing a passion, but it is not pretended that a judgment of this kind, either in its truth or falsehood, is attended with virtue or vice. Skipping a little bit, he says, nor does this reasoning only prove that morality consists not in any relations that are the objects of science, but if examined will prove with equal certainty that it consists not in any matter of fact which can be discovered by the understanding. All right, so that part's going to get a little complicated. I'm skipping down to the bottom of the left-hand column. He says, there is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes us. All right, you're looking for vice. Actually, I'll read this. So take any action allowed to be vicious. Willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you toward this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. All right, so what is virtue and what is vice? Well, let's observe something we consider to be a vice, murder. Observe the act of murder. Where's the vice? Can you see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it? No. And even if you could be inside the murderer and the person being murdered, the emotions they're both experiencing, nothing in there is vice. So he's saying there's nothing in the object that you're observing that's either vicious or virtuous, but what is a matter of fact is your own sentiment in your heart when you observe it. And if you feel disapprobation, that feeling is what we call the vice. And if you watch somebody and you think they're doing a good thing, then that feeling is called virtue. When you have the feeling that you call virtue when you observe certain characters, that's the root of morality. Reason